G'day from soggy Sochi, where we're going to have a look today at the cars that the drivers drove into the track at the last Russian Grand Prix. Are you ready? There's a couple of surprises for you. First up, there are no motorhomes at this track. All the drivers stayed at hotels away from the track, and as such they had to get in, and all of them came via the one road into one of the two car parks and then walked into the track. So what cars were these 20 drivers plus a handful of team principals driving at this race? Well, I'm going to start with the Aston Martins. Sebastian Vettel had a white Skoda Octavia, plain sort of car. He and Britta and Antti would share that ride into the track, and on the wet day, the Saturday, Seb was dropped off at the gates, but on the other days he walked from the car park with Britta and Antti. But it was perhaps his teammate Lance Stroll's car that surprised me the most, because Lance was driving a Porsche Cayenne. I know that there's an Aston Martin dealership in Moscow. I don't know if there's one here. Now, I've owned a Porsche Cayenne and it's a nice car, but it just seemed odd to me when you have an Aston Martin driver driving the competitor's car and to a high-profile event like Formula One. Mercedes were well represented from all of the drivers, and not just the two Mercedes drivers. Here's Lewis. He was in a white 300D, driven by Angela, and Lewis would go to the lesser used end of the paddock, and because only 3 or 4 drivers used that far end car park, it was tricky getting photos of them arriving, and really Lewis you have to get arriving because of his amazing outfit, so there was often a sprint from the main gate up to the second car park to catch him. Valtteri Bottas also parked in that same car park. He also had a 300D. He had a black one. On the subject of black Mercedes, 2 other drivers drove them. Sergio Perez in an E200 Mercedes, and Sergio is a driver who always gets dropped at the swipe gate, so he's got a very short walk, and then his trainer or his manager will drive the car to the car park and walk back in. Exactly the same car was being driven by Max Verstappen, and once again he would get dropped at the gate too and walk in. There were a few comments on social media too, having a dig at Perez for driving one of the opposition's cars. They're a nice comfortable car and you can't blame either driver for wanting to drive one. So they were the 4 Mercedes being driven by drivers at the track. Let's go on to VWs, and there were a number of VWs spotted. Both of the McLaren drivers were driving Tiguan's. Lando Norris in a silver, Daniel Ricciardo in a black one. I'm going to jump to Nicholas Latifi now because he too was driving a VW, this time a Touareg. And I'll throw in one of the team principals only because he too was driving a Touareg, Gunther Steiner. And Gunther is often one of the first team principals into the paddock, sometimes beaten by Franz Tost, but those two are definitely early arrivers. Any Audi fans? Because you would have been happy to hear that both of the Renault drivers were driving Audis. Esteban Ocon had a black A6, and he would often get dropped at the gates and walk in while his trainer would park the car and walk back in. I never saw Fernando Alonso once over the 4 days arrive or leave, but there was one extra car that we couldn't account for. It did have a sticker on saying Alpine, so I'm going to suggest that Fernando Alonso drove this A7. On a lot of overnight international flights, business and first class passengers are offered amenity kits. Often at the end of a flight, there are kits left over. So it doesn't hurt to ask for an extra one if you're flying business or first, or even if you're in economy, asking as you leave. If you've made a good impression with the staff, often they'll turn a blind eye and hand you one. This year, the Ferrari drivers have driven some beautiful cars to the track. Romas have been one of the most popular cars, but this race I was absolutely miffed when I saw Charles arrive in a Chrysler Pacifica. His teammate, on the other hand, Carlos Sainz, had a much more visually appealing car. Yes, it was a Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, but it was impressive looking in the bright red. There are 2 more drivers who drove Jeeps, and one of them was Antonio Giovinazzi in a silver Grand Cherokee, while his teammate Kimi Räikkönen came in a black Wrangler. And I really only picked that up on the very last day because, as you know, Kimi is quite hard to find when it comes to arriving at the track. AlphaTauri drivers have pretty much driven Honda Civic Type Rs all year, as have both Red Bull drivers. But as we mentioned before, the Red Bull drivers went to Mercedes-Benz, so did the AlphaTauri guys follow? No. they went with BMWs, 520Ds to be exact. Here's Yuki arriving in his 520 and Pierre Gasly arriving in his 520. Both of those guys would get dropped off at the gate and walk in to minimise the amount of time. And really, there weren't that many people out the front of the swipe gates for this event. There were probably more at the end of the day than there were waiting at the start of the day. But they weren't the only 520 BMWs, because one of the Williams drivers had one. It was George Russell. And here he is alighting from the car on the Sunday along with his luggage and going straight into the swipe gates. Now I imagine that that car is left there, and whoever it is that's rented it to them or lent it to them picks that up later on at night or the next day. And that leaves us with just two drivers, one being Mick Schumacher. He drove an Audi. When I say drove, he actually passengered in. This is an Audi A7, and his teammate Nikita Mazepin, he was inside a Lexus SUV, stopping at the gates here and having a short walk into the paddock. So that's your 20 drivers, and while there was no real standout knockout cars, the likes of which we had at, say, the British GP or even in Spain with the McLaren of Lando Norris, this time they were pretty rudimentary cars, except I thought the red Jeep of Carlos Sainz, I thought that was probably the standout. Colourful and interesting. Oh, and there are a couple more team principals I'll go through, and a press secretary. Here's Rosa from Mercedes, the press officer, riding in on a scooter one morning. Toto Wolff was arriving and leaving in a Mercedes GLS 400, and in fact on the Sunday night after the race, he and Lewis were given a police escort to the airport. 3 police cars led them away from the track, with both Lewis and Toto driving in separate cars behind them. Ferrari team boss Mattia Binotto, he was in a white Grand Cherokee Jeep, and that car was full of Ferrari people when it arrived. AlphaTauri team boss Franz Tost, like his 2 drivers, was driving in a BMW, and once again a 520D was his choice. And 2 more, Andreas Seidel in a white VW Tiguan. And finally, Fred Vasseur from Alfa Romeo was not in an Alfa Romeo, he was in a white Jeep. So now you know what every driver drove to the track in Sochi. I will ask you before you leave if you wouldn't mind just clicking the like button and subscribing if you haven't done so. And you can hit the notification bell to make sure you never miss a video of mine. Remember, you can join as a member, and at the moment you're getting things like free raw images each race, you're getting monthly wallpapers, you're getting discounts, and at the moment, if you're watching this before October 4th, members get 30% off any of my images at prostarpics.com, that's for personal use. And if you're a VIP member, you'll get 50% off. So you can head to prostarpics.com, select your images, you get the promo code from the community tab if you are a member. For a whole host of F1 photo books, get onto my website kimillman.com, where you'll also find some merchandise. And for my best images live from the track and all during the week, head to my Instagram page at Kim Illman. Thanks for watching, and stay passionate. This year, the Ferrari drivers have driven some beautiful cars to the track. Romas have featured often, some... Bugger. Oh!